Too slow to fear, too late to run. Dawn crept over the southern Iraqi desert on February 25, 1991, turning the sand into a dull bronze sheet stretching endlessly toward Kuwait. The night's chill still clung to the earth, shimmering faintly above the oil-soaked horizon where retreating Iraqi forces had left plumes of black smoke drifting like funereal banners. Along a dusty service road near the Kuwaiti border, a Republican Guard armored column idled in the pale light, its diesel fumes hanging low and unmoving in the cold morning air. Inside the lead T-72, Colonel Mahmoud al-Rashid brought his eye to the commander's periscope. The world narrowed to a circular frame. Dunes, burnt-out trucks, distant highway, nothing unusual. He blinked fatigue from his eyes. His men had been retreating and regrouping for days, pressured on all sides by American airstrikes they could never see coming. The real danger, he assumed, came from the sky in the form of supersonic fighter bombers, sleek F-15s and F-16s dropping precision ordnance at impossible speeds. Those were the weapons he taught his tank crews to fear. Then something odd caught his eye. Low on the horizon, approaching at a leisurely, almost arrogant pace, was a shape that didn't belong. Straight wings, stubby nose, twin engines mounted high on the tail like awkward growths. It wasn't fast, it wasn't elegant. If anything, it looked like a civilian agricultural plane lost over a war zone. Through the periscope, he could even make out its faint grey silhouette wobbling slightly in the morning turbulence. "What is that thing?" his gunner muttered over the intercom. Al-Rashid smirked. An American mistake. Other tank crews came to the same conclusion. Radio chatter crackled with laughter. One commander joked it looked like a flying bathtub. Another said it must be a training aircraft. Perhaps the Americans had run out of real jets. Air defense crews, seeing it on their scopes, called it slow, clumsy, and suicidal to fly this low over Republican Guard armor. But the colonel noticed something else. Something unsettling. The strange jet wasn't climbing or turning away. It was coming straight for them. At 10,000 feet, the A-10 pilot rolled slightly, angling the nose down. The colonel squinted through the periscope. He saw the aircraft's long snout flash. There was a distant metallic growl, first faint, then growing rapidly into a sound that seemed to tear at the air itself. Bert! The GAU-8A Avenger cannon spat a stream of 30mm depleted uranium rounds at nearly 4,000 per minute. The shells traveled so fast that the impact arrived before the sound. The first T-72 in the column lurched violently. A burst of white-hot sparks blossomed from its turret ring. The armor, thought to be proof against anything short of a guided missile, peeled apart like foil. The turret lifted as though struck by a giant invisible hammer. Ammunition cooked off in a chain of internal explosions, turning the tank into a fiery pillar. Seconds later, a second tank detonated. Crews scrambled out, some running, some crawling, all terrified. A third burst of cannon fire walked across the desert floor, shredding armored personnel carriers, trucks, and fleeing soldiers with horrifying ease. In less than 15 seconds, the armored column was no longer a column. It was a burning graveyard. Colonel al-Rashid stared at the devastation through his periscope, all traces of humor gone. The ugly American aircraft circled once, its engines humming coldly against the rising sun. "This is no mistake," he whispered. "This is a weapon." What Iraqi commanders had dismissed as slow, simple, and harmless had just revealed itself as something far more terrifying. A purpose-built tank killer whose very ugliness was a warning they had failed to understand. Born in the shadow of the Fulda Gap. Long before it terrorized Iraqi tank crews in the deserts of Kuwait, the A-10 Warthog was born from a different battlefield entirely, one that never erupted into flames but dominated every strategic conversation of the Cold War. In the late 1960s, NATO planners stared across the Iron Curtain at the Warsaw Pact's armored divisions, tens of thousands of Soviet tanks positioned to burst into West Germany at a moment's notice. It was the nightmare scenario called the Fulda Gap, a natural corridor, where geography favored a massive Soviet armored thrust. If the Red Army ever rolled through it, NATO feared Western Europe could fall in days. The US Air Force had fighters, yes, sleek Phantoms, high-performance interceptors, and tactical bombers. But none of them were designed for one brutal requirement: killing tanks by the hundred under heavy fire while flying low and slow over a battlefield swarming with anti-aircraft guns. Existing jets were fast, but unforgiving, with short loiter times, fragile internal systems, and little tolerance for battle damage. Ground troops had been begging for a dedicated close air support aircraft since Korea, one built around survivability, firepower, and simplicity. The Air Force, focused on nuclear missions and supersonic fighters, had always resisted. Then Vietnam happened. There, the limitations of fast jets became painfully clear. Troops engaged in close combat needed an aircraft that could stay overhead, take punishment, and strike precisely without outrunning the battlefield. The old A-1 Sky Raider, a propeller-driven World War II veteran, often outperformed modern jets in this role. That humiliation forced the Air Force to reconsider its assumptions. Maybe, just maybe, there really was a need for an aircraft built not for speed, but for toughness. In 1970, the Pentagon issued the AX, Attack Experimental Requirement, a call for a new breed of aircraft designed from the ground up to destroy armor and survive the kinds of hits that would tear a sleek fighter apart. Fairchild Republic took the challenge with a radical philosophy. Rather than starting with an aerodynamic shape or a high-performance engine, they began with a question. What if we start with the gun? And not just any gun. Engineers built the airplane around a 7-barreled 30mm rotary cannon so enormous that early mock-ups made the fuselage look like an afterthought attached to a weapon system. The GAU-8A Avenger was essentially a flying anti-tank gun, 19 feet long, weighing roughly 620 pounds unloaded, capable of firing armor-piercing shells heavy enough to punch through Soviet tank columns. Everything else flowed outward from that central idea. To give the pilot a fighting chance at the low altitudes required for tank killing, designers built an armored titanium bathtub, a shell of metal plates up to 1.5 inches thick encasing the cockpit. It protected the pilot from anti-aircraft guns, exploding ammunition, and even catastrophic hydraulic failures. Twin engines were mounted high and separated so a single hit wouldn't take them both out. The wings were thick and straight, optimized for low-speed maneuverability, not elegance. The landing gear was rugged, built to operate from rough, improvised airstrips close to the front lines. Fairchild's test pilots joked that the A-10 looked like it was built by people who had never seen an airplane before. The Air Force's high-speed fighter traditionalists sneered at its blunt nose, exposed rivets, and agricultural silhouette. But the engineers fired back. Ugly airplanes survive. Pretty ones go home in pieces. The A-10 was not made to win air shows. It was made to kill tanks and stay alive doing it. But inside the Pentagon, resistance remained fierce. Many senior leaders wanted to cancel the program, arguing that a modified F-16 could perform close air support missions good enough. They didn't want a slow jet pulling resources away from their cherished air superiority fighters. The Army pushed back, threatening to take CAS into its own hands if the Air Force continued to neglect it. That political pressure saved the AX program from extinction more than once. When the A-10 entered service in 1977 as the Thunderbolt II, a nod to the rugged P-47 of World War II, it did so without much fanfare. To most of the Air Force, it looked like a relic. Too slow for modern combat, too ugly to take seriously, too specialized to justify its existence in an era dominated by supersonic fighters and precision bombs. What they couldn't see was that the very qualities that made it unpopular, its stubborn simplicity, its armored bulk, its oversized gun, were the exact traits that would make it one of the most feared aircraft ever unleashed on a modern battlefield. The world wouldn't understand that until Desert Storm. From an unwanted jet to a battlefield legend. When the A-10 Warthog officially joined the US Air Force in 1977, there was no parade, no celebratory rollout, no glowing praise from fighter generals. Instead, there was skepticism, resistance, and, among many senior officers, quiet disdain. The A-10 was slow. It was subsonic. It wasn't graceful or sleek. It represented a mission the Air Force had always viewed as a distraction from air superiority. Yet despite all of this, the Warthog slipped into service with a stubborn sense of purpose, built for a war no one hoped to fight. In its early days, the A-10's entire existence revolved around one terrifying scenario, a massive Soviet tank assault into Western Europe. Every training sortie, every exercise, and every doctrine manual pictured endless columns of T-72s and BMPs roaring across Germany. The A-10 squadrons trained low, sometimes so low that pilots could see cows scattering below. They practiced firing the GAU-8 at moving armor targets, perfecting dive angles and release timings. The cannon's recoil shook the aircraft but never shook the pilot's confidence. They knew that if the Cold War ever went hot, they would be among the first called to stem the armored tide. But inside the Pentagon, the A-10 was already under threat. Many saw it as a niche tool in an era pursuing high-tech precision weapons. Yet its pilots believed something different, that no matter how advanced air power became, ground troops would always need someone willing to fly low, slow, and close to the fight. The 1980s brought new technologies to the Air Force. stealth research, smart munitions, and advanced fighters like the F-15 and F-16. In this atmosphere, the A-10 looked like an unwanted child. Budget officers questioned its value. Committees studied the possibility of replacing it with modified F-16s. Some in the Air Force leadership openly argued that the A-10 had no place in modern war. Yet something interesting happened. Despite political pressures, the aircraft kept proving its worth. In red flag exercises, high-end combat simulations, the A-10 routinely outperformed expectations. Its ability to find targets visually, survive simulated ground fire, and deliver precise attacks made it popular with Army observers. Ground commanders repeatedly told the Air Force the same thing. Don't take away our Warthogs. Upgrades rolled in quietly. Better weapons integration, improved navigation systems, stronger airframes, and enhanced night operations capability. But still, no one knew whether the A-10 would ever fight the war it was built for, or any war at all. Everything changed on August 2, 1990, when Iraqi forces stormed into Kuwait. The world watched as Saddam Hussein's armored divisions occupied the country in a matter of days. Satellite images showed tank battalions, armored personnel carriers, artillery batteries, and logistics columns digging in along the Kuwaiti border. If the Cold War had taught NATO planners anything, it was what massed armor could do. And now it was real. When the US deployed forces to the Persian Gulf under Operation Desert Shield, the A-10 was finally given the stage it had been waiting for. Squadrons from England, Arizona, and the continental US flew across the ocean, landing on hot, windswept bases in Saudi Arabia. Their pilots set up tents, hung cartoon hog posters, and began rehearsing the mission they had trained for their entire careers, killing tanks. Even before the shooting started, many commanders remained unconvinced. They believed high-tech jets, laser-guided bombs, and cruise missiles would dominate the war. Many assumed the A-10, so slow and low, would suffer catastrophic losses if it ever dared approach Iraqi defenses. But A-10 pilots, hardened by years of training and the confidence that their aircraft could take abuse no other jet could survive, prepared anyway. They studied Iraqi armor layouts, mapped out 8AA emplacements, rehearsed pop-up attacks, and worked directly with ground units to perfect communication. Then, on January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm began. Within hours, the battlefield proved that the A-10 belonged here. Hogs flew hundreds of sorties a day, pounding Iraqi armor, artillery, and convoys. They attacked in sandstorms at low altitude and under heavy fire. They survived hits that would have shredded lighter aircraft. They returned to base with holes the size of dinner plates, and they killed tanks, hundreds of them. By the end of the war, A-10s were credited with destroying more Iraqi armor than any other aircraft in the coalition. The jet that had struggled for approval within its own service had become one of the defining weapons of Desert Storm. After the Gulf War, the A-10's reputation surged. Suddenly, generals who had once questioned it were pointing to its success as proof of the value of dedicated CAS aircraft. The Warthog flew in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq again in 2003. Its durability and simplicity made it invaluable in urban combat and mountainous terrain where fast jets struggled. Modernization transformed it into the A-10C, equipped with advanced avionics, precision-guided bombs, and digital targeting pods. Despite numerous attempts to retire it, the A-10 survived again, because troops on the ground continued to say the same thing. When everything goes wrong, we want the hog overhead. From Cold War afterthought to Gulf War legend, the A-10's evolution proved one thing: the battlefield has room for beauty, but it depends on ugliness for survival. When underestimation meets reality, when the first A-10 sorties launched into Iraqi-occupied Kuwait on January 17, 1991, most senior commanders still believed the Warthog was the wrong tool for the job. From the Pentagon to the pilots' own briefing tents, a common fear lingered. The A-10 might simply be too slow, too low, and too vulnerable to survive modern air defenses. The Iraqis possessed thousands of anti-aircraft guns, radar-guided systems, shoulder-fired missiles, and Soviet-built armored formations. The battlefield looked like a shooting gallery, and the Warthog appeared to be the easiest target in the sky. In those first days, some of those fears seemed justified. A-10 pilots flew directly into dense curtains of fire as they attacked Iraqi armor and artillery positions entrenched across Kuwait. ZSU-23-4 Shilka batteries with their radar-guided quad cannons fired streams of glowing tracers that reached up like claws. SA-9 and SA-13 mobile SAM systems lurked near armored columns, ready to launch infrared-seeking missiles at anything daring to fly below 3,000 feet. The Warthog was hit, multiple times in multiple places. One aircraft returned to base missing several feet of its wingtip. Another limped home with half of its vertical stabilizer blown apart. A third landed with a smoldering engine, hydraulic fluid leaking down the fuselage, and more holes than the maintenance crew cared to count. A few aircraft were lost, and the critics immediately resurfaced, arguing that the A-10 had finally met the battlefield that would expose all its weaknesses. But the pilots flying those missions saw something else entirely. They saw aircraft that, even when mauled by enemy fire, refused to die. They saw jets that kept flying after hits that would have downed an F-16 instantly. They saw systems that kept working long after alarms lit the cockpit like a Christmas tree. And they saw new tactics beginning to take shape, tactics that would soon turn the A-10 from an underdog into the most feared hunter in the desert. The first tactical adjustment was simple but profound. Stop flying predictable routes. Early missions followed standard attack patterns, but Warthog pilots quickly learned to vary their altitude, approach angles, distances, and timing to confuse Iraqi gunners. Instead of straight-in attack runs, they executed pop-up maneuvers, weaving approaches and staggered engagements that forced air defense crews to guess rather than track. The second adjustment involved maximizing the aircraft's strengths. The A-10's long loiter time allowed pilots to circle the battlefield, study enemy positions, coordinate with ground controllers, and strike only when opportunities were perfect. While fast jets had just seconds to identify and fire on a target, the Warthog could take its time, sometimes orbiting long enough to watch enemy vehicles reposition, reload, or reveal weaknesses. And then came the Mavericks. The AGM-65 Maverick missile gave the Warthog a standoff weapon that could blow apart tanks from miles away. Iraqi armor crews, trained to fear close-range cannon runs, soon discovered that the A-10 could kill from a distance as well. Combined with the GAU-8, the A-10's attack envelope became a layered death zone that punished anything from long range to point blank. The third turning point arrived when the kill tallies began to climb. Missions that initially resulted in a single destroyed tank soon produced 4, 6, 8 armored kills in a single sortie. Pilots refined their gun runs, pushing deeper into columns, hitting lead and trail vehicles to trap entire units on roads. When the highway of death became a killing ground of burning trucks and tanks, commanders realized the Warthog was hitting far harder than anyone predicted. By the second week of Desert Storm, something had changed across the Iraqi frontline. Tank crews who once laughed at the A-10's silhouette now listened for a sound that made their blood run cold. The metallic growl of the GO-8 spinning up. Air defense teams who once boasted they could swat the slow American jet from the sky found themselves outmaneuvered by pilots using terrain masking and unpredictable dive angles. Even Republican Guard officers started reporting that their armored formations were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. Within the U.S. Air Force, attitudes began shifting as well. Briefings that once focused on acceptable loss projections now highlighted extraordinary survival stories. An A-10 flying 300 miles back to base after losing both hydraulic systems, another returning with an entire elevator shot off, another shrugging off missile fragments that would have crippled any other jet. The Warthog was proving not just effective, it was proving nearly unkillable. By late January, the conversation had flipped. Commanders no longer whispered that the A-10 might be a liability. Instead, they were asking for more Warthogs in the air, more sorties per day, more strikes on armor, artillery, and fortified positions. The aircraft they once doubted had become one of the most valuable tools in the campaign. The turning points all pointed to the same truth. Every criticism of the A-10, too slow, too ugly, too simple, had masked its true genius. Once pilots aligned its strengths with battlefield reality, the Warthog didn't merely survive, it dominated. The day tank columns vanished. The Desert War unfolded not as American planners had once feared, with massive armored battles between evenly matched forces, but as a one-sided demonstration of what happens when a purpose-built aircraft finally meets the mission it was born for. For all the strategic theories, satellite images, and doctrinal debates, the real story of the A-10 Warthog emerged from the ground level. In burning tank columns, in desperate Iraqi radio calls, in the cockpit voices of young American pilots, and in the testimonies of troops who watched the Warthog arrive in their darkest moments. This is how the myth was made. On the morning of February 6, 1991, 2 A-10s from the 76th Tactical Fighter Squadron took off from King Fahd Air Base under a pale sky streaked with drifting smoke from burning Kuwaiti oil wells. Their mission was simple. Locate a concentration of Iraqi armor reported moving south to reinforce defensive positions. The pilots carried a mixed loadout, Mavericks under the wings for precision strikes, and a full drum of 30mm depleted uranium rounds for anything that survived the missiles. They found the tanks exactly where intelligence said they'd be, a column of T-55s and T-62s strung across a desert causeway like dark stones laid in a line. The Iraqis seemed unaware of the impending attack, their turrets facing southwest as if expecting threats from somewhere else. The lead A-10 pilot, flying at low altitude and scanning with his sensors, locked onto the first tank with a Maverick. A few seconds later, the missile streaked away, trailing a white smoke ribbon that ended in a violent flash. The lead tank erupted in flame and shredded metal, but what happened next cemented the A-10's reputation. The pilots didn't retreat to altitude as many jet crews might. They descended lower. The second Maverick launched, hitting a tank farther down the column. That's when the commander of the armored unit ordered his vehicles to disperse off the road. The A-10s now saw something they loved: movement. The column fragmented, presenting clear silhouettes on the open desert floor. One pilot banked hard, rolled into a dive, and let the JAR-8 sing. The cannon sound reached the tank crews only after the rounds had already struck. Holes appeared in turrets before anyone heard the ripping metal growl. A stream of 30mm penetrators tore through a T-62's frontal armor, igniting propellant charges inside. Another tank backed up desperately, only to catch a second burst that blew off one track and immobilized it. The second A-10 swooped low, scattering infantry and knocking out truck-mounted anti-aircraft guns. By the end of the sortie, 13 tanks were burning. A second attack in the afternoon destroyed another 10. The two pilots returned to base with empty gun drums, black-rimmed goggles, and the astonished realization that they had personally dismantled an armored formation in a single day. Word spread quickly. The A-10 was no longer the butt of jokes. It was becoming something closer to a desert predator. The most infamous battlefield of the war was not a tank engagement, but a road, Highway 80, the route Iraqi forces used to retreat from Kuwait City to Basra. In the final days of the conflict, Iraqi units fleeing the coalition's ground advance packed the road with tanks, APCs, trucks, buses, and command vehicles. Many of these were still armed, still dangerous, and still capable of slowing the coalition's advance. The corridor became a legitimate military target. A-10s were among the first aircraft tasked with attacking the retreating force. When the Warthogs arrived, they found a traffic jam stretching for miles, vehicles wedged bumper to bumper, soldiers running between them, some abandoning their machines as the first airstrikes hit. One A-10 pilot described the scene. It looked like a scrapyard someone set on fire. Everywhere you looked, something was exploding. On the morning of February 6, 1991, two A-10s from the 76th Tactical Fighter Squadron took off from King Fahd Air Base under a pale sky streaked with drifting smoke from burning Kuwaiti oil wells. Their mission was simple: locate a concentration of Iraqi armor reported moving south to reinforce defensive positions. The pilots carried a mixed loadout, Mavericks under the wings for precision strikes, and a full drum of 30mm depleted uranium rounds for anything that survived the missiles. The GAU-8 made quick work of lightly armored vehicles, a single 3-second burst stitched across a row of trucks, turning their engines into twisted wreckage. Iraqi soldiers dove for cover but found little protection among metal that shredded so easily under 30mm fire. But what horrified Iraqi commanders most were the tanks. Many believed their T-72s and T-62s would require dedicated anti-tank weapons to destroy. Instead, the A-10 guns punched through armor plates, ignited fuel cells, and caused catastrophic internal spall, superheated metal fragments bouncing inside the crew compartment with lethal effect. Some turrets popped off, others burned from within. Coalition reports later estimated that A-10s attacked hundreds of vehicles on the route, leaving behind a haunting tableau of blackened steel stretching beyond the horizon. Iraqi survivors gave the corridor a macabre nickname: the Valley of Fire. To the Warthog pilots, it was a grim confirmation of everything they'd trained for. Not every A-10 success came from overwhelming offensive power. Some came from the aircraft's near-legendary ability to absorb damage and return home when any other jet would have fallen from the sky. The most dramatic example occurred 12 years after Desert Storm, in a very different Iraq. On April 7, 2003, Captain Kim Campbell and her wingman were tasked to support ground forces engaged in intense combat in downtown Baghdad. Thick columns of black smoke rose from burning buildings. The city's defenses, AAA guns, RPG teams, small arms fire, and possible manpads, blanketed the air with lethal threats. During a low pass to strike an enemy position, Campbell felt her jet jolt violently. The aircraft snapped into an uncontrolled roll. Warning lights flashed as the hydraulics, both primary and backup, failed simultaneously. For any other aircraft, that would have been the end. Without hydraulics, modern jets cannot control their elevators or rudders. They crash. But the A-10 was not like other jets. Campbell switched to manual reversion, a system of cables and cranks that allowed the pilot to physically move control surfaces by brute strength alone. The jet fought her every inch, heavy and stubborn, but she coaxed it level. For the next 70 minutes, she flew what amounted to a crippled metal brick with wings through hostile airspace. Her aircraft dripped fluid, vibrated violently, and left a trail of smoke. Iraqi gunners continued to fire as she limped southward, using every ounce of training to keep the jet from rolling over and plummeting into the city. When she finally reached base and brought the aircraft down, maintenance crews stared in disbelief. The tail was shredded. Holes peppered the fuselage. Parts of the stabilizer were missing. The skin was torn. And yet the Warthog had flown home. It was exactly what it was built to do. For Iraqi tank crews, the terror of the A-10 wasn't just the destruction it caused. It was the speed with which everything happened. Through interviews and reconstructed accounts, one can imagine the perspective from inside a T-55 moments before impact. The crew hears a distant hum, then a strange growl unlike anything they know. It isn't the whistle of a bomb. It isn't the roar of a jet overhead. It is something alien, a metallic snarl that seems to vibrate through the armor. Then the tank shudders. A flash blinds the gunner. Fragments ricochet inside the turret. The loader screams. The commander's periscope goes dark. Within fractions of a second, the crew compartment fills with acrid smoke as burning metal and spalling fragments whip through the interior. One Iraqi tanker, captured after Desert Storm, described it simply, "We heard the gun, then everything was fire." The GRU-8 didn't just kill tanks, it erased them from the battlefield with chilling efficiency. American pilots flying the A-10 in Desert Storm were a particular breed, informal, confident, irreverent, and absolutely dedicated to the ground troops they supported. They named their aircraft, decorated their helmets with hog snouts, and often compared the Warthog to a pickup truck, simple, tough, and always ready to work. During interviews after the war, one pilot said, "You don't fly the A-10 for glory, you fly it because soldiers on the ground need you, and because it works." Another added, "It's not pretty, but neither is war." Many remembered watching Iraqi tank crews abandon vehicles at the first sight of the A-10's silhouette. Some saw enemy soldiers waving white cloths from tank hatches. Others watched entire formations scatter when they heard the cannon firing somewhere in the distance. All of them understood what Iraqi commanders learned too late. In close air support, steadiness and survivability matter more than glamour. During the coalition ground offensive, Warthogs operated so effectively that some Iraqi units dissolved before US armored divisions ever reached them. In one sector, an entire battalion of Iraqi mechanized troops surrendered to a small reconnaissance element simply because they believed A-10s were overhead. The aircraft weren't even in the area. The psychological weight of the cannon, the sound, the reputation, it preceded the aircraft itself. The human stories, the pilots, the tankers, the ground troops, reveal something that statistics alone cannot. The A-10's impact was not just measured in vehicles destroyed, but in fear created, morale shattered, and lives saved. For the Americans fighting on the ground, the Warthog became a symbol of reassurance. For the Iraqis, it became a symbol of doom. Each strafing run wasn't just an attack. It was a message written in fire and metal. The battlefield belonged to the Warthog. The sound came first. Long before Iraqi soldiers saw the A-10, long before its grey wings appeared against the blazing sky, they heard a noise that defied comparison. Some described it as a growl. Others said it sounded like a metal saw cutting through the world itself. Troops stationed near armored columns learned to stop what they were doing and freeze when the noise rolled across the desert. Veterans later recalled that they could feel it in their chest before they heard it in their ears. Psychological effects of the Warthog emerged far earlier than military intelligence realized. Iraqi units who had prepared to face fast jets, aircraft so quick they were gone again before a soldier could finish a prayer, had not anticipated something that stayed. The A-10's persistence was its most unnerving trait. It flew overhead for hours, circling like a vulture. Crews could not tell whether it was simply observing or preparing to strike. That kind of uncertainty ate away at morale with every passing minute. Some Iraqi platoon leaders reported that their men refused to move vehicles during daylight. Even a single A-10 at high altitude could freeze an entire column. Ground convoys began traveling only at night or under cover of sandstorms, and even then with extreme caution. A rumor spread through multiple units. The Americans had an aircraft that could see through darkness. It wasn't entirely true, but the belief alone was enough to cripple daytime operations. For the Iraqis, the Warthog became a symbol of inevitability. Soldiers described engaging coalition forces while constantly glancing upward, Waiting for the moment, the desert itself began to roar. Crews inside tanks reported feeling trapped in metal coffins, helpless to react once the cannon opened fire. After the first few days of the war, some Iraqi officers tried to reposition armor only in short, frantic bursts, rolling forward for mere seconds before cutting engines and hiding again. Nothing they tried seemed to work. The psychological strain reached its peak during the ground offensive when many Iraqi units never even saw American ground troops before surrendering. Some waved improvised white flags from tank hatches the moment they heard distant aircraft engines. Others abandoned vehicles entirely, leaving them intact in perfect rows as they fled on foot. When interrogated later, many admitted they believed the A-10 was overhead, even when it wasn't. Meanwhile, on the coalition side, the effect was the complete opposite. The same sound that terrified Iraqi soldiers brought American and Allied ground forces a sense of security, unlike anything else in the air campaign. Infantrymen described hearing the GAU-8 fire and feeling a surge of confidence so strong it bordered on emotional. Soldiers pinned down by machine gun fire shouted with relief when they heard the Warthog approaching. Some Marines joked that the A-10's cannon was the voice of God clearing his throat. The Warthog's presence changed how ground commanders planned operations. Knowing support could arrive and stay overhead, leaders took risks that would otherwise have been unacceptable. Pilots coordinated directly with forward air controllers, adjusting angles of attack with near-instant responsiveness. To troops on the ground, it felt like the A-10 existed solely for them. A guardian angel with titanium skin and a cannon the size of an automobile engine. As the war continued, Iraqi troops developed something medical officers later compared to the Jabo panic German soldiers experienced in World War II. Physical stress responses at the mere mention of ground attack aircraft. Men grew nauseous, hands shook uncontrollably. Sleep became impossible whenever engines droned in the distance. In interviews after the war, Iraqi commanders spoke about units that simply could not be motivated to man their positions if A-10s were expected. The battlefield had changed. What mattered now was not just firepower, but the fear of firepower. The knowledge that if the A-10 found you, survival was unlikely. The destruction left behind by the A-10 forced analysts on both sides to confront a difficult truth. This slow, stubby aircraft was not simply effective because of its gun or its pilots, but because its entire design represented a strategic philosophy fundamentally different from that of modern jet warfare. It was the embodiment of a simple idea: stay close to the battlefield, endure whatever the enemy throws at you, and deliver precise, overwhelming force exactly where ground troops need it. Understanding the Warthog's impact begins with the math of the GAU-8's armor-piercing rounds. The 30mm depleted uranium penetrator was engineered to punch through the sloped armor of Soviet tanks at typical Cold War engagement angles. When it struck Iraqi T-55s or T-72s, tanks often less protected than their Soviet counterparts, the effect was brutally predictable. The round usually penetrated cleanly, then exploded into a storm of incandescent fragments inside the crew compartment. Ammunition cooked off, hydraulics burst. Crew survival, even if the tank did not immediately explode, was rare. This meant the A-10 could eliminate armored units not over hours, but in minutes. The aircraft didn't need to drop expensive precision munitions. A few short bursts of the cannon could disable an entire formation. In a war built on speed, this efficiency mattered. Supply lines, artillery parks, command vehicles, and armored spearheads that Saddam Hussein relied upon to hold Kuwait found themselves with a new and devastating predator circling above them. But the cannon was only part of the story. The Warthog's ability to loiter transformed the rhythm of the battlefield. While fast jets had to race to a target, drop a bomb, and immediately leave, the A-10 stayed. Its pilots watched enemy movements in real time. They coordinated with ground observers, adjusting attacks with a precision no guided weapon alone could achieve. If a convoy tried to disperse, the A-10 followed. If artillery crews attempted to flee their guns, the Warthog strafed the pathways ahead of them. It was the persistence, more than any single strike, that broke Iraqi maneuver warfare. Iraqi commanders quickly realized that traditional Soviet-style doctrine could not function under a sky patrolled by A-10s. Armored units that once relied on mobility found themselves pinned in place, unable to reposition without drawing fire. Headquarters that depended on radio trucks and logistics trains lost the ability to coordinate movements. Even elite Republican Guard divisions found themselves exposed. Their best armor could not withstand the combination of Mavericks from distance and 30mm fire at close range. The Warthog also changed how coalition forces allocated their own power. Because the A-10 provided reliable, near-constant close support, high-performance jets were freed to pursue deeper strikes, command centers, airfields, Scud launchers, and strategic infrastructure. The A-10 became the anchor point of the battlefield, the dependable hammer that removed threats blocking the ground advance. In this way, it served as a force multiplier, one aircraft enabling dozens of others to pursue their missions more effectively. Even cost factored into its strategic significance. The A-10 was cheap to fly compared to the F-15 or F-111. Its maintenance demands were straightforward, its engine simple, and its airframe forgiving. For every dollar spent operating a Warthog, commanders received more time over target, more direct firepower, and more flexibility than almost any other platform in the theater. The coalition's ability to sustain high sortie rates depended heavily on aircraft like the A-10 that could fly often, carry heavy loads, and require minimal downtime. Finally, the Warthog demonstrated a principle that advanced air forces sometimes forget. Survivability equals reliability. Ground commanders learned they could call for the A-10 even under the worst conditions, tight urban fights, sandstorms, heavy smoke, or thick enemy fire, and trust that the aircraft would arrive and stay. Iraqi troops learned a different lesson. If the A-10 found them, retreat often came too late. The war showed that modern militaries do not always need the fastest jet or the stealthiest bomber. Sometimes they need a weapon that can be wounded and still return to the fight. A machine built not to dominate the sky, but to own the ground beneath it. When the guns finally fell silent in 1991, the A-10's reputation on the battlefield was already cemented, but the fight for its survival back home was only beginning. In the aftermath of Desert Storm, the US Air Force found itself at a crossroads. With the Soviet Union collapsing and budgets shrinking, the service began re-evaluating every aircraft in its inventory. To many senior leaders, the future was clear. Stealth, multi-role fighters, and precision-guided munitions would define the decades ahead. The A-10, with its rugged skin and old-fashioned mission, seemed like a relic from a war that never came. But the battlefield had its own opinion. Ground troops who served in Desert Storm wrote letters, gave interviews, and filled after-action reports with one message: the Warthog had saved lives. When artillery pinned down infantry, when tanks advanced on vulnerable positions, when soldiers needed immediate help, it was the A-10 that appeared. Not the high-performance jets at 20,000 feet, not the bombers dropping tonnage from afar. It was the slow, armored guardian that flew so low you could see the pilot's helmet. Still, the pressure to retire the aircraft grew. Committees argued that new technology, satellite-guided bombs, advanced sensors, faster jets, made a dedicated close air support platform unnecessary. Some generals even argued that the F-16 could take over the role entirely. That idea seldom survived contact with anyone who had actually fought alongside the A-10 in combat. Then new wars came, and with them, new lessons. In Kosovo, the A-10 flew through some of the densest air defenses in Europe and returned with scars that would have killed other jets. In Afghanistan, it navigated canyons and mountain passes where fast jets struggled to maneuver at all. In Iraq, again, in 2003, it hunted insurgents in urban terrain where precision and patience mattered more than speed. These conflicts reinforced the same truth over and over. Ground troops needed the Warthog, and the Warthog delivered. For pilots who flew it, the aircraft felt like a partner rather than a machine. They told stories of returning to base with holes punched through wings, with fuselage panels shredded, with damage so severe that maintainers refused at first to believe the aircraft had stayed airborne. One described the Warthog as a jet that loves you back. Another said simply, it's the only aircraft where the designer cared more about the pilot than the aerodynamics. Upgrades followed, some modest, others transformative. The A-10C variant emerged with digital avionics, modern targeting pods, precision weapon integration, and battlefield networks that made the aircraft more capable than any of its earlier iterations. It was still slow, still armored, still unmistakably a Warthog, but now it could deliver JDAMs, laser-guided bombs, and advanced surveillance just as effectively as it fired the GAU-8. The jet built for World War III became a precision workhorse of 21st century conflicts, but no upgrade could change the fact that the A-10 was designed for a world of tank divisions and conventional warfare. Critics argued that in an age of anti-access defenses and near-peer competition, the Warthog's survivability might finally be outmatched. They pointed to new threats, long-range missiles, integrated radar networks, and advanced fighters, as evidence that the A-10's era had ended. Yet something stubborn remained in the data, in the testimony, and in the memories of those who survived because of it. When US troops were under fire in narrow alleys or remote valleys, when they needed an aircraft willing to descend into danger and stay there, it was still the A-10 they requested. No other platform inspired the same confidence. None could match the simple, brutal reliability of a titanium bathtub wrapped around a pilot determined to protect the men below. Even Iraqi veterans, looking back years later, acknowledged the aircraft's dominance. Some spoke of the way conversations changed in the ranks, how the laughter that once greeted the A-10 silhouette turned into dread. Others recalled the sound of the cannon echoing across the sand at twilight, ripping through the evening calm like a physical force. One former Republican Guard tanker summarized it bleakly. "When we heard the gun, we knew the day belonged to the Americans." Perhaps the most powerful symbol of the A-10's legacy sits not on a battlefield, but in museums and air parks across the United States. In one exhibit, a restored A-10 stands beside the rusted remains of an Iraqi tank hull. The tank is peeled open, its armor punctured by clean, circular holes, grim signatures of the 30 mm rounds that tore through it decades earlier. The aircraft next to it is immaculate, its surfaces smooth, its paint unblemished. Children run their hands along its wings. Veterans stand quietly near its cannon, remembering the sound it made on the worst days of their lives, and the best. Visitors read placards listing statistics. Thousands of sorties in Desert Storm, hundreds of tanks destroyed, countless troops protected. But numbers alone cannot capture the essence of the Warthog. What lives on is something deeper, a sense of trust, forged between pilots and soldiers, between a nation and a machine that never pretended to be anything other than what it was. The A-10 was not fast, it was not pretty. It didn't claim superiority in the sky, it didn't need to. It existed to fly low, take hits, and deliver justice with a cannon that spoke in thunder. For Iraqi commanders who once dismissed it, the revelation came too late. There was no mistaking its power once they watched entire armored formations vanish in minutes. No mocking its appearance once they saw what it could do. Many later admitted that the A-10 was the one aircraft their troops feared more than any other. Not the stealth bombers, not the supersonic fighters, not the precision-guided weapons that fell from high above. It was the slow one, the ugly one, the one that stayed until the job was done. Decades after Desert Storm, the legacy of the Warthog endures not because of its shape or its speed, but because of what it represented. A philosophy of war built on survivability, persistence, and overwhelming force at the moment ground troops need it most. It was a weapon shaped by the demands of reality, not the ambitions of theory. And so the story ends where it began, in the desert, under a rising sun, as an Iraqi commander stared in disbelief at burning tanks and understood too late what the Americans had sent against him. The aircraft he once dismissed had rewritten the battlefield in fire and steel. The Warthog had spoken, and the desert remembered its voice.